The mop hit the marble floor with a wet slap. William Carter's knees cracked as he dropped down, the sound lost beneath the echo of expensive shoes clicking past his head. He was 54 years old, and for the last 8 years, every morning had started the same way, invisible. The lobby of Riverside Tower stretched 40 feet to the ceiling, all glass and steel, and the kind of money that didn't notice men like him. Will pressed the mop head into the spill, watching brown coffee seep into the white strings. His hands were rough, the knuckles swollen from decades of work that mattered once. 25 years he'd spent building machines at the Ford plant in Dearborn, assembling components that weighed more than he did machinery that served thousands. Now he cleaned up after people who'd never held a wrench in their lives. The alarm had gone off at 4:30, same as always. Will's body didn't need it anymore. 15 years of sleeping alone had taught him that dawn came whether you wanted it or not. He'd showered in the dark, dressed in the blue uniform that never quite fit right, and caught the 5:45 bus that stopped 3 blocks from his apartment. The building opened at 6, and by 6:15 he was pushing his cart through the service entrance, nodding at Danny Wilson, the security guard, who sometimes remembered his name. His reflection caught in the polished floor as he worked. Thin gray hair, face lined from worry more than aged shoulders that used to be broader before the weight of the world settled on them. Will Carter looked exactly like what he was, a man the world had decided to forget. The memory came without warning, the way it always did. Elizabeth laughing in their kitchen, flour on her nose from baking cookies with the kids. That was the Beth he held on to, not the woman in the hospital bed, not the closed casket at the funeral. 15 years gone, and some mornings he still reached for her side of the bed before remembering it would always be empty. The day she died, he'd been under a Caterpillar engine grease up to his elbows when his phone buzzed. The floor supervisor's face told him everything before the words came out. "There's been an accident. Your wife." Will remembered the drive to the hospital, how every red light felt like a punishment, how he'd run through those automatic doors already knowing. Beth was 39. A drunk driver ran a red light on her way home from the grocery store. Jonathan was 17, Margaret 14. They'd sat in that waiting room, and when the doctor came out, Will had to be the one to tell his children their mother wasn't coming home. 2 years later, the Ford plant closed. 25 years of service, a severance check for $45,000, and a handshake from a manager who couldn't meet his eyes. The economy was collapsing. Jobs were bleeding out of Michigan like a wound that wouldn't close. And Will had 2 kids who needed futures more than he needed pride. He sold the house in Dearborn for $180,000, packed everything they owned into a U-Haul, and moved to Detroit. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom for him, a pull-out couch for Jonathan, and Margaret got the converted closet they called a second bedroom. Will told them it was temporary, that he'd find another engineering job, that things would get better. He'd believed it when he said it. But the interviews dried up. 50 applications, 50 rejections. Too old, overqualified, not the right fit for our company culture. The severance money was bleeding away on rent and groceries and Jonathan's college applications. Will had a choice to make, and he made it the only way he knew how. He stopped looking for who he used to be and started taking what was available. The job at Riverside Tower paid $32,000 a year. It came with health insurance and a bus pass and the kind of invisibility that let Will pretend he wasn't falling as far as he actually was. When Jonathan got into state on a partial scholarship, Will told him the new job was in facility operations. When Margaret asked what exactly he did, Will said he managed building maintenance. Neither of them pushed for details, and Will told himself that wasn't the same as lying. That was 8 years ago. Jonathan was 32, now running a logistics company he'd built from nothing. Margaret was 29, a lawyer who just made partner and closed deals worth more than Will had earned in his entire life. They were supposed to be his redemption proof, that all the sacrifice meant something. Instead, they were the reason he couldn't tell the truth. How could he admit that while they were conquering the world, their father was mopping floors and emptying trash cans? The coffee stain was gone, the floor gleaming again. Will straightened slowly, his lower back protesting the movement. 54 wasn't supposed to feel this old, but 8 years of bending and lifting and kneeling had carved away at him. He pushed the cart toward the service elevator, checking his watch. 6:45. The morning rush would start soon, 2,000 people flooding through these doors, and not one of them would see him. The elevator doors opened, and Will rolled his cart inside, pressing the button for the 8th floor. The bathrooms up there needed attention before the executives arrived. He caught his reflection in the polished steel doors. Blue uniform name tag that said William Carter in letters too small to read from more than 3 feet away. This was who he'd become. This was his place. The eighth floor corridor was empty, the kind of silence money bought. Will unlocked the men's room and started his routine: check the stalls, refill the soap dispensers, empty the trash, mop the floor. He worked methodically the way he'd worked on assembly lines, each task flowing into the next. There was a kind of meditation in it, a rhythm that kept his mind from wandering too far into the past or future. The sound of footsteps made him pause. Too early for executives. Will glanced up as Brandon Pierce rounded the corner, phone pressed to his ear, face already red with whatever argument he was having. Pierce was 38, vice president of operations, the kind of man who wore suits that cost more than Will made in a month. They'd cross paths before, always the same way: Pierce walking through Will like he was air. But this morning was different. This morning Pierce was distracted, gesturing with his free hand, not watching where he was going. Will saw it happening, the collision course, and stepped back instinctively. His cart shifted, the bucket sloshing. Pierce's shoulder clipped the edge, and suddenly there was a grande Starbucks cup tumbling through the air lid, popping off, dark liquid arcing across the freshly mopped floor. Pierce stopped mid-sentence, staring at the spreading puddle like Will had personally thrown it there. His face went from red to purple, veins standing out in his neck. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Will's throat tightened. "Sir, I'm sorry, I was moving out of the way." "Out of the way!" Pierce's voice rose, bouncing off the corridor walls. "You were standing in the middle of the hallway with your cart. Do you have any idea what this suit cost?" There was a spot on Pierce's jacket barely visible. Will could feel the words building in his chest, the defense he wanted to make. He'd been against the wall. Pierce hadn't been looking. The cart hadn't moved until Pierce hit it. But the words died before they reached his mouth, because Will knew better. He'd learned this lesson 8 years ago on his first day, when the supervisor told him the only rule that mattered: don't make trouble. "I apologize, sir. Let me clean this up." Pierce stepped closer, and Will could smell cologne that probably cost more than his weekly grocery budget. Up close, Pierce's eyes were flat, the kind of emptiness that came from never having to consider anyone else's perspective. "You know what your problem is?" Pierce's voice dropped to something almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. "You're old, you're slow, you don't belong in a building like this." The words landed like punches. Will felt his hands tighten on the mop handle, felt the anger rising in his chest, hot and familiar. 25 years he'd spent building machines that required precision and skill. He'd trained younger workers, fixed problems engineers couldn't solve, earned the respect of men who knew what real work looked like. And now this child in an expensive suit was telling him he didn't belong. "I'll clean it up right away, sir." "Know your place, old man." Pierce turned away, already back on his phone, the spill, and the man who'd clean it already forgotten. Will stood there for a moment, mop in hand, staring at the coffee spreading across his morning's work. Then he knelt down the same way he'd knelt for 1,000 other messes and started over. Across the hallway, Danny Wilson had watched the whole thing. The security guard stood by the elevator bank pretending to check his tablet, but Will could see the discomfort in the way Danny wouldn't meet his eyes. Danny was 24, working nights to pay for community college classes. He'd asked Will for advice once about electrical systems, and Will had spent 30 minutes explaining circuit loads and breaker panels, patient the way he'd been patient with Jonathan when he was young. Danny had thanked him, called him sir, treated him like he mattered. Now Danny looked away, and Will understood. Speaking up meant risking your job, and nobody risked their job for a janitor. The coffee took 15 minutes to clean properly. Will worked in silence, wringing out the mop, making sure there were no streaks, no evidence that anything had happened. When he finished, the floor gleamed like glass, and Brandon Pierce was long gone. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine. Will cleaned the executive bathrooms, emptied trash cans, replaced paper towels in dispensers that probably cost more than his monthly rent. At 8:30, he was in the third-floor break room when he overheard 2 junior analysts talking. "Did you see what happened to Pierce this morning?" "The janitor thing," someone sent a video in the group chat. Will's chest went cold. He kept his back turned, focusing on wiping down the counter. Pierce went off on him, called him old and slow, told him he didn't belong. Classic Pierce. 3rd time this month. "Remember what he did to that new cleaning woman?" "Rebecca something." "Yeah, HR didn't do anything about that either." The conversation moved on to weekend plans, but Will stayed frozen at the counter. Someone had recorded it. The humiliation he'd swallowed in private wasn't private anymore. It was entertainment, something to laugh about over coffee, a story to share before moving on to more important things. He finished the break room and moved on pushing the cart with mechanical precision. The morning stretched into afternoon. Will ate lunch in the basement, sitting on an overturned bucket next to the boiler room. Turkey sandwich, apple bottle of water. The same meal he'd eaten for 8 years because it was cheap and didn't require refrigeration. His phone buzzed. Margaret's name lit up the screen. "Hey, Dad, just checking in. How's work?" Will looked down at his uniform at the dirt under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing ever completely removed. "Work's fine, sweetheart. How's the Peterson case coming?" "Closed it yesterday. 15 million settlement." The partners are thrilled. Pride filled her voice, the kind of pride Will remembered from high school graduation, from law school acceptance letters, from every milestone that proved she'd escaped the life he'd lived. "That's wonderful, Maggie. Your mother would be so proud." A pause, then softer. "Dad, I want to come visit, see where you work. I've been asking for months and you keep putting me off." Will's throat tightened. "We're doing renovations right now. It's a mess. Maybe next month." "You said that last month." Concern edged into her tone. "Are you okay? You sound tired." "Just a long day. Listen, sweetheart, I should get back to work." "Love you." "Love you too, Dad." He ended the call and sat in the darkness listening to the boiler hum. Margaret had been 14 when Beth died, young enough to still need a father who had answers. Will had tried to be that man, tried to fill the hole Beth left, but all he'd managed was survival. Keep the lights on, keep food in the fridge, keep them from seeing how badly he was drowning. Jonathan had been easier in some ways. 17-year-old boys didn't ask as many questions, didn't need reassurance the same way. Jonathan had thrown himself into school, into applications, into building a future that would prove the tragedy hadn't broken him. Will had watched his son harden, watched him learn that success was the best revenge against a world that took without asking. And Margaret, she'd learned something else. She'd learned that control was safety, that money was armor, that if you built walls high enough, loss couldn't reach you. Will saw it in the way she managed her life, in the careful planning, in the refusal to let anyone close enough to hurt her. She'd only been 14 when she stood in that funeral home and decided never to be that vulnerable again. Now they were successful beyond anything Will had imagined, and the distance between his life and theirs was a canyon he didn't know how to cross. Every phone call was a performance, every visit a careful dance around the truth. They thought he managed a building. They didn't know he disappeared into it. The afternoon brought more work. A clogged drain on the 7th floor, a broken light fixture in the parking garage, a spill in the cafeteria where someone had dropped a tray of spaghetti. Will moved from task to task, his body operating on autopilot while his mind circled back to Brandon Pierce's words. "Know your place." At 3:45, the overhead speaker crackled to life. "William Carter, please report to Human Resources." The cart stopped. Will's hands went numb on the handle. In 8 years, he'd been to HR exactly 3 times hiring paperwork. Insurance enrollment, in the time he'd reported Brandon Pierce for cornering Rebecca Miller in the parking garage. That third visit had ended with a sympathetic smile from Patricia Green and a promise to look into it. Nothing had changed. Rebecca still came to work scared, and Pierce still did whatever he wanted. Will left his cart in the service corridor and took the elevator to the 8th floor. His reflection stared back from the polished doors. Blue uniform, graying hair. 54 years old and about to lose the only thing keeping him from complete irrelevance. The HR office had a waiting area with chairs that looked comfortable but weren't. Will sat hands on his knees while a young receptionist typed without looking at him. 5 minutes passed, 10. The door to the conference room opened and Patricia Green stood there, her face carefully neutral. "Will, come in, please." The conference's room was designed to intimidate. Long table leather chairs, windows overlooking the city. Brandon Pierce sat at one end, Robert Caldwell at the other. Caldwell was 55 building manager, the man who'd hired Will 8 years ago. He wouldn't meet Will's eyes. Patricia sat down, folder in front of her. "Will, we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised." "Concerns? We've received multiple complaints about your conduct." Patricia's voice was gentle, the kind of gentleness that preceded bad news. "Employees have reported feeling uncomfortable with your presence." Will's chest tightened. "Uncomfortable? How?" Brandon leaned forward and Will saw something in his face that looked almost like satisfaction. "Multiple people have complained that you linger in areas after you've finished cleaning, that you make them uncomfortable." "I've never." "Are you calling them liars?" Brandon's voice sharpened. "We have documented complaints, Will. This isn't a debate." Patricia pushed the folder forward but didn't open it. We have to take these seriously. Can I see them, the complaints? Will's voice came out steadier than he felt. I have the right to know what I'm being accused of. Caldwell finally spoke, his voice heavy. Well, you're an at-will employee. We don't have to provide specifics. The room tilted slightly. Will gripped the edge of the table, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers. 8 years. 8 years of arriving early, staying late, fixing things nobody else knew how to fix. 8 years of making himself invisible, and now they were using that invisibility against him. I've worked here 8 years without missing a single day. The words came out quiet, controlled. I've never had a single complaint in my file. I've saved this company thousands of dollars by fixing things myself. And now suddenly there are multiple complaints. Brandon's smile was thin. Maybe people were afraid to speak up before. Maybe they're tired of seeing an old man who can't keep up. The truth hit Will like cold water. This wasn't about complaints. This was about this morning, about coffee on the floor, about a vice president who didn't like being embarrassed. The complaints were cover paperwork to justify a decision already made. Patricia slid a document across the table. This is a termination agreement. You'll receive 2 weeks severance. Security will escort you out today. Will stared at the paper. His name was already typed in, the date filled out. They'd prepared this before he walked in the door. This was theater, a performance of due process where the outcome had been decided hours ago. I want to see the complaints. Will's voice was barely a whisper. Sign the paper, Will. Caldwell wouldn't look at him. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Will picked up the pen. His hand shook just slightly enough that the signature came out jagged. He'd built machines that required precision down to the thousandth of an inch. He'd raised 2 children after losing the love of his life. He'd survived poverty and grief and the slow erosion of dignity that came from being invisible. And now, with a shaking hand, he signed away the last piece of who he used to be. Patricia took the paper, and something flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe? Or pity? It didn't matter. I'm sorry, Will. Security will escort you out. I know the way. Brandon stood up, adjusting his jacket. Company policy, we need an escort. The walk from the 8th floor to the lobby took forever. 2 security guards flanked Will, Danny Wilson, and an older man whose name Will had never learned. They stopped at Will's locker to collect his things. A photograph of Beth and the kids from 15 years ago. A spare jacket. The coffee mug Jonathan had given him, one Christmas white ceramic with "World's Best Dad" in fading letters. Everything fit in a cardboard box that used to hold printer paper. 8 years condensed into something you could carry under one arm. The elevator ride down was silent. Danny stared at his shoes. The other guard checked his phone. Will held the box and tried to remember how to breathe. The lobby was full. 4:15 on a weekday meant the building was draining professionals heading home to lives that included dinner reservations and gym memberships and futures. They all stopped when they saw Will and his security escort. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones came out. Will walked straight ahead the way Beth had taught him years ago. When people look down on you, you look straight ahead. He passed the front desk where the receptionist pretended to be busy. He passed the seating area where 2 junior executives whispered behind their hands. He passed Brandon Pierce, who watched from the 2nd floor balcony with his arms crossed and something that might have been a smile. Rebecca Miller stood near the revolving doors, a cleaning cart beside her. Tears streamed down her face. Will met her eyes for just a second, and in that second, he tried to communicate everything he hadn't been able to say. I'm sorry, I should have fought harder. I should have made them listen. Then he was through the doors and standing on the sidewalk in the late afternoon sun. The guards stopped at the threshold. Danny looked like he wanted to say something, but the words never came. The doors revolved shut, and Will was alone on the street with his box of memories and nowhere to be. The bus ride home took 22 minutes. Will sat in the back box on his lap, watching Detroit slide past the windows. 15 years he'd lived in this city, and it still felt foreign. The apartment building was 6 stories of worn brick and peeling paint, the kind of place where neighbors didn't make eye contact, and the elevator worked about half the time. Will climbed to the 3rd floor, unlocked 3B, and stepped into the dim quiet of home. The apartment was exactly how he'd left it that morning. Bed made with military precision, dishes washed and put away. Nothing out of place because there was nothing to place. He'd lived here 8 years and never bothered to make it feel like more than a stopping point. He set the box on his kitchen table and sat down in the dark. Outside, traffic hummed. Somewhere above, a couple argued in muffled voices. Will sat perfectly still and let the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. The photograph of Beth stared at him from the box. She was smiling the way she always smiled in pictures, like she knew something the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. 20 years together, and Will had never managed to learn that trick. Hope had died in that hospital waiting room, and what was left was just momentum, the habit of moving forward because stopping meant looking too hard at what was gone. His phone buzzed. Jonathan's name lit the screen. Will stared at it, watching it ring once, twice, 3 times. The voicemail notification appeared. The phone went dark. It buzzed again. Jonathan persistent the way he'd been persistent about everything since he was old enough to walk. Will let it go to voicemail again. The third time it was Margaret, then Jonathan, then Margaret again. They knew something was wrong. Maybe they'd seen the video. Maybe one of their contacts had connections at Riverside Tower. Or maybe they just knew him well enough to feel the silence. The fourth call came at 7:30. Jonathan again. Will's hand moved almost without conscious thought, picking up the phone, pressing the button. "Dad, where have you been? I've been calling for 3 hours." Will opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. His throat closed around them, trapped them somewhere behind his teeth. "Dad, are you okay? Talk to me. I need to tell you something." "Okay." Jonathan's voice shifted, concern sharpening to focus. "What's going on?" Will closed his eyes. In the darkness, he could see Beth's face the day they brought Jonathan home from the hospital. The way she'd held their son like he was made of glass, like she couldn't believe something so perfect could be real. She'd looked at Will and said, "We made this. We made something good." "The job I told you about. Facility operations at Riverside Tower." "Yeah, what about it?" "That wasn't the whole truth." Will's voice cracked. "I wasn't managing anything. I was a janitor, John. For 8 years, I've been cleaning floors and bathrooms." Silence stretched across the line. Will counted his heartbeats. 5, 10, 15. "You were what?" "A custodian. I mopped floors. I emptied trash. I fixed things when they broke because it was cheaper than calling a contractor." The words spilled out now, unstoppable. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to feel guilty about succeeding while I was on my knees cleaning up spills. 8 years." Jonathan's voice was barely audible. 8 years you've been lying to us." "Not lying, just not telling the whole truth." "That's the same thing, Dad." Anger crept in now, hot and hurt. "Every time I offered to help, every time Maggie tried to send money, you said you were fine. You said you didn't need anything." "I didn't want your money." "No, you wanted to suffer alone. You wanted to prove something that nobody asked you to prove." Jonathan's breathing was ragged. "Why are you telling me this now?" Will looked at the cardboard box on the table. 8 years in a box you could carry under one arm. "Because today I got fired. They said I made people uncomfortable. They said I was old and slow and didn't belong there. They had security walk me through the lobby in front of everyone." "They what?" The anger in Jonathan's voice shifted direction. "Who did this? Give me names." "John, it doesn't matter." "The hell it doesn't matter. Give me a name, Dad." "Brandon Pierce, Vice President of Operations." "But there's nothing you can do. It's done. Stay there. Don't go anywhere. I'm coming." "John, you're in Chicago. It's a 4-hour drive." "Then I'll be there in 4 hours. Maggie's in town for a deposition. I'll call her. We'll both be there tonight." Jonathan's voice was hard now, the voice he used in boardrooms when people tried to tell him something couldn't be done. "And Dad, we're going to fix this." "There's nothing to fix. I signed the papers. It's over." "It's not over." The line went quiet for a moment. When Jonathan spoke again, his voice was softer. "You spent your whole life taking care of us. You sold everything to make sure we had futures. You worked jobs that destroyed your body so we could have chances you never got. Now it's our turn." Will wanted to argue, wanted to tell his son that this was different, that some things couldn't be fixed with money or connections or force of will. But the words wouldn't come because somewhere deep down in a place he'd been ignoring for 15 years, he wanted someone else to carry this. Just for a little while. Just long enough to breathe. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay. I'll be there by midnight. Don't answer the door for anyone else." The line went dead. Will sat in the dark apartment, phone in his hand, the weight of confession settling over him like a blanket. Outside, Detroit hummed with 1,000 lives being lived, 1,000 people who had places to be, and people who needed them. For the first time in 8 years, Will wasn't invisible. His children saw him now, really saw him, and the terror of that was almost as profound as the relief. He looked at Beth's photograph one more time. The smile that knew secrets. The eyes that had seen him at his worst and loved him anyway. They turned out good, he whispered to the empty room. Better than good. They turned out like you. The photograph didn't answer, but Will thought maybe it didn't need to. Beth had known this day would come. She'd known that eventually the walls would crack, that the armor would fail, that Will would have to let someone else be strong for a while. He just wished she was here to see what happened next. The headlights cut through darkness on I-94 Chicago, bleeding into Detroit in a blur of highway lights and semi-trucks. Jonathan Carter gripped the steering wheel hard enough to hurt knuckles white against black leather. His phone was mounted on the dashboard, Margaret's face filling the screen as she navigated her own route from the financial district. I can't believe he didn't tell us. Margaret's voice cracked around the edges. 8 years, John. 8 years on his knees while we were closing million-dollar deals. Jonathan's jaw clenched. The anger was still there, hot and sharp, but underneath it something else was growing. Guilt thick enough to choke on. When was the last time you actually visited him? Margaret went quiet. Jonathan knew the answer because it was the same as his. 6 months, maybe 7. Work had consumed everything the way work always did when you were building something from nothing. Midwest Logistics had started in a garage 3 years ago, and now it handled freight for half the retailers in the region. Success had a cost, and apparently that cost was noticing when your father was drowning. He didn't want us to know. Margaret's face shifted on the screen, city lights sliding across her features. Every time I offered money, he said he was fine. Every time I tried to visit, he made excuses. Because he's been lying to protect us from feeling exactly how we feel right now. Jonathan's voice went flat. Responsible. The GPS showed 2 hours and 43 minutes remaining. Jonathan pushed the accelerator harder, the Audi's engine responding with a purr that cost more than his father made in 6 months. The irony wasn't lost on him. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. David Klein, the corporate attorney Midwest Logistics, kept on retainer. Jonathan hit speaker. John, I got your message. You want me to look into a wrongful termination case? Riverside Tower, Detroit. Employee named William Carter fired today. I need everything you can find on the VP who did it. Brandon Pierce. Pierce, Klein's voice shifted into lawyer mode. I know that name. Give me 30 minutes. The line clicked off. Margaret was watching him through the screen, something calculating in her expression that reminded Jonathan of their mother. Beth had looked like that when she was planning something, when she decided a problem needed solving and was working through the angles. What are you thinking? Jonathan kept his eyes on the road. I'm thinking about the Peterson case I just closed. $15 million settlement for workplace harassment. The company tried to bury it with NDAs and payoffs, but we had documentation. Paper trail showing pattern and practice. She paused. If this Pierce has done this before, there'll be evidence. Dad said he reported Pierce once for cornering a woman in the parking garage. Nothing happened. Margaret's face went hard. Then we make something happen. The highway stretched ahead, endless asphalt disappearing into darkness. Jonathan's mind was racing, cataloging resources, calculating leverage. Midwest Logistics had contracts with 3 companies that leased space in Riverside Tower. Those contracts were worth a combined $8 million annually. He wondered how fast those companies would reconsider their lease agreements if the building became associated with a harassment scandal. His phone buzzed again. Klein faster than promised. You're going to want to hear this. Brandon Pierce, 38, VP of Operations at Riverside Tower for 6 years. Before that, 3 other corporate positions, all ending with quiet resignations. I pulled what I could from public records and reached out to some contacts. And 4 documented settlements in the last 7 years. Sexual harassment, hostile work environment, age discrimination. Total payout of $380,000, all covered by the companies he worked for. The cases were sealed with NDAs, but money leaves traces. Jonathan's hands tightened on the wheel. They knew. Riverside Tower knew what he was when they hired him. Or they didn't care. Rich companies protect their VPs. It's cheaper to settle than to admit you have a culture problem. Klein's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd seen this pattern too many times. You want me to file suit? Not yet. I want to know who else is buried in those NDAs. Can you reach out, let them know someone's willing to fight this publicly? I can try, but NDAs are ironclad, John. These people signed away their right to talk. Everyone has a price. Find it. He ended the call. Margaret was watching him with something that might have been approval or might have been concern. You're going to burn Riverside Tower down. I'm going to make them wish they'd treated an old janitor with basic human decency. Margaret's expression softened. He's not just an old janitor, he's our father. The GPS showed 1 hour and 57 minutes remaining. Jonathan pushed harder, watching the speedometer climb past 80. His father had spent 8 years invisible, and Jonathan had been too busy building an empire to notice. That ended tonight. His mind drifted back 15 years to the hospital waiting room, where everything changed. He'd been 17, sitting between his father and sister, watching strangers in scrubs walk past with news for other families. When the doctor finally came, the look on his face told them everything. Jonathan remembered his father's hand on his shoulder steady, despite the way Will's whole body was shaking. His father had held them together that night, and for 2 years after working double shifts at Ford while Jonathan finished high school, and Margaret navigated grief with the determination of someone who decided never to feel that helpless again. Then Ford closed and Will had made a choice. He'd sold everything to give his children futures, and Jonathan had been too grateful to question what that cost. What kind of son takes his father's sacrifice and then forgets to ask if the sacrifice ever ended? The phone buzzed again. Margaret this time, her car somewhere behind him in the darkness. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Dad protecting us from feeling responsible." "Yeah, he's been doing that our whole lives. After Mom died, he worked himself to exhaustion so we wouldn't have to worry about money. When Ford closed, he moved us to Detroit and told us it was an opportunity. He's been carrying everything alone because that's what he thinks fathers do." Jonathan's throat tightened. "We should have seen it. How could we? He made sure we didn't." Margaret's voice carried a weight Jonathan recognized. She was analyzing breaking the problem into components the way she did with legal cases. "He taught us that success was the best way to honor Mom's memory. So we succeeded. And while we were succeeding, he was scrubbing floors. We're going to fix this. You can't fix 15 years of loneliness, John. You can't fix the fact that our father spent his 50s on his knees cleaning up after people who couldn't see him." The truth of that hit hard. Jonathan wanted to argue, wanted to believe that money and lawyers and leverage could undo what had been done. But Margaret was right. Some things broke in ways that couldn't be repaired, only acknowledged. "We can make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." "That's not the same as fixing what happened to Dad." "I know," Jonathan's voice was barely audible over the engine. "But it's what we've got." Detroit appeared on the horizon, city lights against industrial darkness. Jonathan took the exit too fast, tires protesting as he navigated surface streets toward his father's neighborhood. Margaret's headlights stayed behind him, 2 cars moving through empty streets in the kind of silence that came after midnight. The apartment building looked worse than Jonathan remembered from his last visit. Brick facade, crumbling windows, dark except for scattered squares of yellow light. His father lived on the 3rd floor of this place, while Jonathan's condo in Chicago had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. The math of that felt obscene. They parked in adjacent spaces. Margaret climbed out of her Mercedes wearing the same suit she'd worn to court that morning, looking like she belonged anywhere except here. Jonathan watched her take in the building, saw her face do the calculation he'd just done. This was what their father's pride had bought him. Dignity at the cost of everything else. The lobby door was unlocked, the security system long since abandoned. They climbed stairs that smelled like old carpet and something Jonathan didn't want to identify. At 3B, Jonathan raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. "What do we say to him?" Margaret looked at him, and for a moment she wasn't a partner at a prestigious law firm. She was 14 again, standing in a funeral home, asking the same question about a different impossible situation. "We tell him the truth, that we're sorry we didn't see, that we're here now." Jonathan knocked, footsteps inside slow and heavy. The door opened, and there was Will Carter, looking 10 years older than the last time Jonathan had seen him. His father's face was drawn exhaustion, carved into lines around his eyes. He wore sweatpants and a t-shirt that had been washed so many times the color had faded to gray. They stood there in the doorway, father and children, the space between them filled with 8 years of half-truths in careful distance. Will's voice came out rough. "You didn't have to come." Margaret moved first, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. Will stood rigid for a moment, then his shoulders sagged and he held his daughter the way he'd held her 15 years ago when the world ended the first time. "Dad," her voice muffled against his shoulder, "I'm so sorry." Jonathan stepped inside, closing the door behind them. The apartment was exactly what he'd expected, and worse. One room serving as kitchen and living space, a bedroom barely big enough for a twin bed, everything clean but worn down to the edges. This was where his father had lived for 8 years, while Jonathan bought designer furniture and Margaret collected art. Will pulled back from Margaret, wiping his eyes quickly. I made coffee. It's not good, but it's hot. They sat around a kitchen table that wobbled on uneven legs. Will poured coffee into mismatched mugs, his hands steady now, falling into the ritual of hospitality even when everything else had collapsed. Jonathan wrapped his hands around his mug and tried to find words adequate to the moment. Tell us everything from the beginning. So Will did. He started with the day Ford closed and worked forward through 8 years of early mornings and late nights of fixing things he wasn't paid to fix because he couldn't stand watching something break when he knew how to repair it. He talked about learning to be invisible, about the careful dance of staying out of sight while still being useful. He described Brandon Pierce's harassment of Rebecca Miller the way HR had smiled sympathetically and done nothing. And he told them about this morning, the coffee spill, the words that cut deeper than any physical blow. Know your place, old man. The humiliation of walking through that lobby while hundreds of people watched him reduced to nothing. When he finished, the coffee was cold and the sky outside had started to lighten toward dawn. Margaret's voice was carefully controlled. You reported Pierce before, and they ignored you. Rebecca needed the job. She has a daughter. I couldn't risk making things worse for her. So you stayed quiet while he terrorized people. Jonathan heard the accusation in his own voice and hated it. Will's eyes flashed. I did what I could. You think I don't know what it looks like? You think I don't hate myself for not doing more? That's not what John meant. Margaret shot Jonathan a look that could cut glass. He's angry at them, not you. But that wasn't entirely true, and they all knew it. Jonathan was angry at everyone. At Pierce for being a predator. At Riverside Tower for enabling him. At his father for accepting it. At himself for being too successful and too distant to notice any of it. Will stood up, moving to the window. Dawn was breaking over Detroit, gray light washing across abandoned factories and empty lots. This city had been dying for decades, and everyone who could afford to leave had left. Will had stayed because he couldn't afford anything else. I don't want revenge. His voice was quiet. I want this to be over. It's not over. Jonathan stood too, joining his father at the window. Klein found 4 settlements. 4 other people Pierce hurt, and the companies just paid them off and moved him along. Will's shoulders tensed. What are you planning? We're going to expose him. Every settlement, every victim who's willing to talk. We're going to make sure everyone knows what kind of man Brandon Pierce is. And then what? Will turned to face him. He gets fired. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. Either way, I'm still the old janitor who lost his job. That doesn't change. Margaret moved to stand beside Jonathan. You're not just an old janitor. You're our father. And what they did to you is illegal. Proving that in court takes time I don't have. I need another job. I need income. You don't need anything. Jonathan's voice came out harder than intended. Maggie and I have more money than we know what to do with. Let us help. Will's face hardened. I don't want your charity. It's not charity, it's family. Family doesn't owe me a living. Jonathan felt the argument building, the same conversation they had had a dozen times over the past 2 years. Every offer of help met with the same stubborn refusal. His father's pride was a wall Jonathan couldn't climb, a fortress built from years of carrying everything alone. Margaret put a hand on Jonathan's arm. Dad, just listen, please. She pulled a folder from her briefcase, spreading documents across the kitchen table. Building plans, financial statements, photographs of a property Jonathan didn't recognize. This is the old community center on East Jefferson. It's been vacant for 3 years. The city's been trying to sell it, but nobody wants the liability of renovation. She pointed to the financial statements. John and I bought it last month. We were going to surprise you with it after we finished repairs. Will stared at the documents. Why would you buy a condemned community center? Because we were going to renovate it and hire you to manage it. Margaret's voice was steady. We know you won't take money for nothing, but running a community center, helping people who need it, that's work, real work. Jonathan watched his father's face, saw the conflict playing out. Pride warring with practicality. The desire to refuse warring with the exhaustion of fighting alone. You bought a building to give me a job. We bought a building to give the community a resource. We wanted you to run it because you're good at fixing things, because you care about people who get forgotten. Jonathan paused. And yeah, because we wanted to give you something better than scrubbing floors for people like Brandon Pierce. Will sat down slowly, hands resting on the documents. I would have said no. We know. That's why we were going to present it as a fait accompli. Building bought renovations started just needs someone with your skills to oversee operations. You manipulated me. We love you, Margaret's voice cracked. And we've watched you suffer for 8 years because you were too proud to let us help. So yes, we manipulated you. We'd do it again. The apartment went quiet. Through the wall, a neighbor's alarm clock started beeping. The city was waking up to another day of survival. People dragging themselves to jobs they hated because rent didn't pay itself. Will's hands trembled slightly on the documents. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. Jonathan pulled out his phone. But while you're thinking, we're going to deal with Pierce. Klein answered on his first ring. John, it's 5 in the morning. I need you to file a wrongful termination suit against Riverside Tower. William Carter, age discrimination and hostile work environment. I want it filed today. Today's Saturday. Monday then, first thing. Klein's voice sharpened with interest. You get the old man to agree. Jonathan looked at his father. Will was staring at the community center plans like they were written in a language he didn't speak. Working on it. But whether he agrees or not, I want the suit ready to go. And I want to know by end of business Monday how many of those settlement victims are willing to talk. John, those NDAs. Find a way around them. Offer to cover any legal costs they incur for breaking the agreement. Hell, offer to pay their mortgages for a year if that's what it takes. I want witnesses. Will's head came up. Jonathan, you can't bribe people into testifying. I'm not bribing anyone. I'm removing the financial barrier that keeps them silent. Jonathan turned back to the phone. Get it done, David. He ended the call. Margaret was watching him with something that might have been admiration or might have been concern about how far he was willing to go. You're serious about this? They humiliated our father in front of hundreds of people. They threw away 8 years of loyal service because one vice president didn't like being embarrassed. Yeah, I'm serious. Will stood abruptly pacing to the window and back. This isn't what I want. I don't want lawyers and lawsuits and my face on the news. What do you want, Dad? The question stopped Will mid-pace. He stood there in the middle of his small apartment, looking lost in a way that broke something in Jonathan's chest. I want to matter. I want my work to mean something. I want to wake up without feeling like I'm counting down days until I'm too old, or too slow, or too broken to be useful. His voice dropped. I want to stop being invisible. Margaret crossed to him, taking his hands. Then let us help you be visible, not as revenge, as justice. Justice doesn't change anything. It changes everything. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms. Every person who sees your story, who sees what they did to you and knows it was wrong, that changes something. Every company that thinks twice before firing a loyal employee because they're afraid of the consequences, that matters. Jonathan moved to join them. Dad, you spent your whole life teaching us that some things are worth fighting for, that you don't let bullies win, that dignity isn't negotiable. I also taught you to pick your battles. This battle picked us, Jonathan's voice was firm. The moment they walked you out of that building, they made this personal. You can refuse our help. You can refuse the lawyers and the lawsuit and the community center. But we're not going to pretend this is okay. We're not going to watch our father get treated like garbage and do nothing. Will looked between his children. Jonathan saw the moment something shifted in his father's face, some wall crumbling that had been standing for 15 years. If we do this, we do it right. No bribes, no shortcuts. We use the truth. The truth is enough. Margaret pulled out her phone. I'm calling my investigator. If there are more victims, we'll find them. If there's documentation, we'll get it. Everything legal, everything by the book. And if we lose, Jonathan smiled and there was something of his mother in it. The smile that meant someone had underestimated what Beth Carter was willing to fight for. We won't lose because they don't know who they're dealing with. Will's expression shifted, something almost like hope creeping in around the edges. Who are we dealing with? A 54-year-old man who raised 2 children alone after losing his wife, who worked jobs that broke his body so those children could have futures. Who knows more about machinery and systems and fixing what's broken than any engineering degree could teach? Margaret's voice was steel wrapped in silk. They think they fired an old janitor. They have no idea they just made an enemy out of the man who taught us never to quit. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, like the walls couldn't contain what was building. Jonathan saw his father, straightening shoulders, pulling back the defeat, draining away, to be replaced by something harder. Okay. Will's voice was quiet but steady. We do this, but we do it for everyone. Not just me, for Rebecca and the others. For every person who got pushed out because they didn't fit someone's image of what an employee should be. Jonathan extended his hand. Deal. They shook, and in that grip, Jonathan felt echoes of every time his father had held his hand as a child. The strength that had carried them through grief and poverty. The steadiness that had never wavered even when everything else fell apart. Margaret's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her expression shifted. My investigator just sent something. Brandon Pierce's social media. She turned the phone so they could see. A Facebook post from 6 months ago, Pierce at a charity gala, champagne glass raised. The caption read, "Another successful quarter." Success is about surrounding yourself with excellence and cutting out the dead weight. Dead weight, Will's voice was flat. He posted this 2 days after firing a 60-year-old accountant. Margaret scrolled down. And here, 3 months ago, the only thing worse than mediocrity is old mediocrity refusing to retire gracefully. Jonathan felt rage building in his chest, hot and focused. This wasn't just about his father anymore. This was about a man who'd built a career on cruelty, who'd hidden behind corporate protection while destroying lives. We need to get into Riverside Tower, talk to people who work there, find out how many others there are. Will shook his head. Security won't let you pass the lobby. Then we don't go through the lobby. Jonathan pulled up a map on his phone. The building has loading docks, service entrances, places where someone who knows the layout could get in. You want to break in? I want to talk to the employees who matter, the ones who actually keep that building running. Jonathan looked at his father. The invisible ones. A slow smile spread across Will's face. Danny Wilson works the loading dock on Saturdays. Security is lighter on weekends. Can you get us in? Will considered for the long moment. Then he reached for his jacket, the one with Riverside Tower embroidered on the pocket that he'd worn for 8 years. Let's find out. The drive to Riverside Tower took 20 minutes through empty weekend streets. Jonathan drove Will in the passenger seat, navigating Margaret following in her Mercedes. The building rose against the morning sky, glass and steel, catching the first real light of day. Will directed them to the rear entrance, a utilitarian concrete dock where delivery trucks unloaded during the week. A single security guard sat in a booth, head down over his phone. As they got closer, Will leaned forward. That's Danny. Jonathan pulled up to the gate. Danny looked up and his face went through a series of rapid changes when he saw Will. Surprise, guilt, confusion. Will rolled down his window. Hey, Danny. Mr. Carter. I didn't think I'd see you here again. Danny's voice carried genuine regret. I'm sorry about yesterday. I should have said something. You were doing your job. Will's voice held no accusation. These are my kids, Jonathan and Margaret. We need a favor. Danny looked from Will to the expensive cars, something clicking into place. Your kids, right. The ones who... He trailed off, understanding dawning. What kind of favor? We need to talk to some of the staff. Off the record. People who work weekends, people who might have had problems with Brandon Pierce. Danny's expression hardened at the name. A lot of people have problems with Pierce, but they're not going to talk about it. Not if they want to keep their jobs. They might talk to someone who already lost his. Will paused. Someone who can't be threatened anymore. Danny studied them for a long moment. Then he glanced at his phone, checking something. Pierce doesn't come in on Saturdays. Neither does Caldwell. Patricia Green sometimes shows up around 9. He looked back at Will. You've got maybe 2 hours before anyone who'd report you arrives. That's all we need. Danny hit a button and the gate rolled open. Loading dock 2, there's a maintenance entrance that'll take you to the service corridors. But Mr. Carter, if you get caught, I'm already fired. What else can they do? They parked in the shadows of the loading dock, 3 vehicles that cost more combined than most of the building's employees made in a year. Will led them to a nondescript door, swiped a card that shouldn't have worked anymore, but apparently did, and they were inside. The service corridors were a different world from the polished lobby. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, the guts of the building laid bare. Will navigated with the ease of someone who'd walked these halls thousands of times, leading them past storage rooms and mechanical spaces until they reached a break room. 3 people sat around a table, early shift custodial staff starting their day. They looked up as Will entered, and the shock on their faces was immediate. Will, what are you doing here? Rebecca Miller stood up, coffee forgotten. She looked different from the terrified woman Will had described, anger replacing fear. I need to ask you something, Rebecca. Off the record, no obligations. Will gestured to Jonathan and Margaret. These are my children. They're lawyers. They want to help. Rebecca's eyes went to Margaret, professional recognizing professional. Help with what? Building a case against Brandon Pierce, wrongful termination, hostile work environment. But we need people willing to talk about what he's done. The other two custodians exchanged glances. One of them, a woman in her 50s, spoke up. Talking gets you fired. I'm already fired. Will pulled out a chair sitting at their table like he'd done 100 times before. But if enough of us talk, if we document what's been happening, maybe the next person doesn't have to choose between speaking up and keeping their job. Rebecca sat back down slowly. He cornered me in the parking garage 3 months ago, told me I should be nicer to him if I wanted good shifts. When I reported it, HR said there was no evidence. Patricia Green told you that. She's the one who takes the reports, but nothing ever happens. Rebecca's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd fought and lost too many times. My daughter needs health insurance. I can't risk losing this job over he said, she said. Margaret pulled out a legal pad. What if it wasn't he said, she said? What if we had multiple witnesses? What if we had documentation of a pattern? The older custodian leaned forward. I've been here 12 years. I've watched Pierce run off 4 good people. Always the same. He makes their lives miserable until they quit, or he manufactures a reason to fire them. Names. Margaret's pen was poised. I need names and dates. For the next hour, they talked. Rebecca and the other custodians shared stories that built into a portrait of systematic abuse. Pierce targeting older employees, women he found attractive, anyone who challenged him. The HR department that took reports and filed them away. The building manager who valued profit over people. Jonathan recorded everything on his phone, backing up Margaret's notes. His father sat quietly listening to the litany of cruelty that had been happening around him for years. The guilt on Will's face was painful to watch. When they'd exhausted the current shift's knowledge, Danny appeared in the doorway. You've got 30 minutes before day shift arrives. You should go. But Will wasn't done. Who else works weekends? Anyone from facilities? Danny hesitated. Carl Henderson, he's a maintenance tech. Works in the boiler room on Saturdays. They found Carl elbow deep in a malfunctioning AC unit, swearing creatively at machinery that refused to cooperate. He was 62, built like someone who'd done manual labor his entire life, with forearms that could bend rebar. Will approached carefully. Need a hand? Carl looked up, recognition dawning. Will Carter, heard you got canned. About time someone stood up to Pierce, even if it cost you. I didn't stand up to him. I got fired for being in his way. Same difference in his book. Carl wiped his hands on a rag. You here for revenge? I'm here for the truth. Carl studied them, taking in Jonathan's expensive suit and Margaret's lawyer bearing. Something shifted in his expression. I'm 62. I've got 3 years until I can take Social Security without penalty. Pierce knows that. He's been on me for 6 months about retirement, making comments about dead weight, and making room for younger blood. Carl's jaw tightened. My wife has MS. Our insurance covers her medications. If I lose this job before 65, we lose everything. Margaret's voice was gentle. What if testifying against Pierce meant you couldn't be retaliated against? What if we could guarantee your job protection? Nobody can guarantee that. I can. Jonathan pulled out his phone. Midwest Logistics has a contract with 3 companies in this building worth $8 million annually. Those companies renew their leases based partially on building reputation. If this building becomes associated with age discrimination and harassment, those companies will find other space. Carl's eyes narrowed. You're threatening to tank their revenue. I'm offering leverage. They protect the people willing to testify, or they lose major tenants. That's extortion. That's business. Jonathan's voice was cold. They built this situation. They created an environment where speaking truth means losing everything. I'm just evening the odds. Carl looked at Will. This what you want, scorched earth. Will met his eyes. I want you to be able to work until you're ready to retire. I want Rebecca to not be afraid in parking garages. I want the next 54-year-old who gets hired here to make it to 55 without being told he doesn't belong. The boiler room felt quiet except for the hum of machinery. Carl's hands worked the rag, thinking, I'll testify, but if this goes sideways, if I lose my job and my insurance, that's on you. It won't go sideways. Margaret's voice carried absolute certainty. We don't lose. They gathered information for another 20 minutes. Carl knew where bodies were buried, had documentation of maintenance requests that got ignored because Pierce had budget for renovations, but not for worker safety. He had emails, work orders, a trail of negligence that went beyond harassment into criminal territory. Danny appeared again, more urgent this time. Patricia Green just pulled into the parking lot. You need to leave, now. They moved quickly, Will leading them back through the service corridors. But as they approached the loading dock exit, voices echoed from ahead. Patricia Green and Robert Caldwell, too early, too close. This way. Will pulled them down a side corridor through a door marked electrical. The room was cramped, filled with breaker panels and conduit, barely enough space for all of them. Through the door, they heard Patricia and Caldwell pass, discussing damage control. The video from yesterday had spread beyond the building. Corporate was asking questions. Liability was being assessed. We need to get ahead of this before it becomes a lawsuit. Caldwell's voice was tight with stress. It might already be too late for that. Patricia sounded tired. I've been getting emails from employees all morning. People are talking. Shut it down. Anyone who causes trouble gets terminated for cause. We can't afford a mass complaint. Margaret's hand clenched into a fist. Jonathan felt his own anger spike. They were planning to silence people through fear, the same tactic that had worked for years. When the voices faded, they slipped out through the loading dock. Danny was waiting, face pale. Green saw your cars. She's calling the police. Will swore softly. Get out of here. If she asks, you never saw us. Mr. Carter. Danny, you've got college to finish. Don't throw that away for me. They ran for the vehicle's engines, starting in sequence. Jonathan's Audi pulled out first, Margaret's Mercedes behind Will in the passenger seat, watching Riverside Tower recede in the mirror. They're going to fire everyone who talked to us. Not if we move first, Jonathan was already calling Klein. David, I need you to file that wrongful termination suit today. Not Monday. Today. It's Saturday. Courts are closed. Emergency filing. Cite evidence of ongoing retaliation, whatever you have to do. Jonathan's voice was steel. And I need a press release ready to go. By end of business today, I want every news outlet in Detroit to know that Riverside Tower is being sued for systematic age discrimination and harassment. Klein went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice carried reluctant admiration. You're declaring war. They declared war when they threw my father away. I'm just returning fire. The call ended. Margaret was watching from her car through the rear window. Will sat beside Jonathan, hands gripping the door handle like he was holding onto something solid while the world spun. This is going to get ugly. It was already ugly, Dad. We're just dragging it into the light. Will turned to look at his son. You sound like your mother. She never backed down from a fight either. Jonathan felt his throat tighten. He'd been 17 when Beth died, old enough to remember everything, young enough to still need her. She'd been fierce in ways people didn't expect, soft-spoken, until something threatened her family. Then she became something else entirely. What would she say about this? Will was quiet for a long moment, watching Detroit slide past the windows. She'd say that sometimes the right thing costs more than you want to pay, but you pay it anyway because the alternative is living with the weight of not trying. Then we pay it. They drove in silence back to Will's apartment. The sun was fully up now, Saturday morning, washing across the city. Inside 3B, they regrouped. Margaret spread her notes across the table while Jonathan paced, phone to his ear, coordinating with Klein. By noon, the lawsuit was filed. By 2, the press release went out. By 4, the first news van pulled up outside Riverside Tower. Jonathan's phone started ringing off the hook. Reporters wanting statements. Business contacts asking what the hell he was doing. The CEO of one of Midwest Logistics' biggest clients, voice tight with barely controlled fury. You're jeopardizing an $8 million relationship over your janitor father. Jonathan's response was calm. I'm protecting my family from predators. If that's a problem for you, I'm sure I can find other clients who value basic human decency. The line went dead. Margaret looked up from her laptop. That's going to cost you. Everything costs something. At least this way I get to choose what I'm paying for. Will sat at the table watching his children work with something like awe on his face. They'd transformed his small apartment into a war room, laptops and legal pads and phones, creating a command center that would bring Riverside Tower to its knees. His phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. Will answered cautiously. Mr. Carter, this is Channel 4 News. We'd like to interview you about the lawsuit against Riverside Tower. Will looked at Jonathan and Margaret. They both nodded. Yes, he heard himself say, I'll talk to you. Because his children were right. Silence had protected him for 8 years, and all it had bought was invisibility. Maybe it was time to be seen. The reporter arrived at 6 camera crews setting up in Will's living room. The questions were direct, probing, designed to get sound bites. Will answered carefully, guided by Margaret's coaching. He talked about 8 years of loyal service, about fixing what was broken, about being told he didn't belong. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He spoke with the calm dignity of someone who'd survived worse than Brandon Pierce and would survive this too. The interview aired at 10. By 11, it had been picked up by networks across the state. By midnight, it was national news. The old janitor who turned out to have powerful children. The David and Goliath story of a 54-year-old man standing up to corporate abuse. America loved an underdog, and Will Carter had just become the underdog of the moment. Jonathan's phone rang at 1 in the morning. Klein's voice crackling with exhaustion and excitement. "You're not going to believe this. 3 of the NDA victims just called. They want to talk. They saw Will's interview, and they're ready to go public." Jonathan looked at his father asleep finally on the couch. Margaret curled in the armchair with her legal pad. His family had spent 15 years scattered orbiting around grief and guilt and the weight of things unsaid. Tomorrow, Riverside Tower would wake up to find itself under siege. Tomorrow, Brandon Pierce would discover that the old man he'd thrown away had children who'd learned never to quit. But tonight they were together, and that was enough. The morning sun cut through the apartment windows 3 weeks later, finding Will Carter in a place he never expected to be the center of a storm. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the lawsuit hit the news. Reporters, supporters, people who'd been fired under similar circumstances, reaching out to share their stories. The invisible had found their voice, and they were speaking through him. Margaret sat at the kitchen table surrounded by depositions and witness statements. Her investigator had turned up documentation that went beyond what anyone anticipated. Brandon Pierce's pattern of abuse stretched across 4 companies and 12 years. The settlements they'd found were just the visible tip money paid to make problems disappear. Underneath was a network of intimidation, strategic firings, and HR departments that protected executives instead of employees. Jonathan was on his 3rd conference call of the morning, his voice carrying the edge of someone who'd stopped caring about political niceties. Midwest Logistics had lost 2 clients over the lawsuit companies that valued their relationship with Riverside Tower more than basic ethics. Jonathan had replaced them within a week, telling each new client exactly why he was available. Some people wanted to work with a man who fought for his father. Integrity, it turned out, had market value. Will watched his children work and felt something shift in his chest. For 15 years, he'd carried everything alone because that's what fathers did. Beth's death had carved out a hole in their family, and Will had tried to fill it by being both mother and father provider and protector. He'd succeeded in raising remarkable children, but somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten they weren't children anymore. "Dad, you need to see this." Margaret turned her laptop around. On screen, Patricia Green sat in a lawyer's office, her face drawn and tired. The timestamp showed this morning an hour ago. Patricia's voice came through the speakers, quiet but steady. "I've been complicit in a system that destroyed good people. I took reports of harassment and filed them away. I processed terminations I knew were unjust. And I did it because I was afraid of losing my job, of being next on Brandon Pierce's list." The interviewer's voice, clinical and professional. "You're willing to testify to this?" "I am. I'm also willing to provide documentation, emails, termination records, settlement agreements, everything I was told to keep confidential." Patricia's hands trembled slightly on camera. William Carter spent 8 years keeping that building running. He fixed problems that saved the company thousands. And they threw him away like garbage because one man's ego was bruised. "I can't be part of that anymore." The video ended. Will sat back processing. Patricia Green had been the face of HR's indifference, the person who'd taken his report about Rebecca and done nothing. Now she was burning bridges to stand with him. "She's risking everything." Will's voice was quiet. "She's doing the right thing." Margaret's tone carried no sympathy. Finally, Jonathan ended his call and moved to join them. Klein says Patricia's testimony changes everything. "With her evidence in the 3 NDA victims willing to talk, we can prove systematic abuse. This isn't about one firing anymore. It's about cultural rot from the top down." "How's Rebecca?" Will had been worried about her since they'd left the building 3 weeks ago. "Single mother, healthcare dependent on her job, the most vulnerable of all of them." "Safe. We got her legal protection, and Klein negotiated a temporary restraining order preventing any retaliatory action while the suit is pending." Jonathan paused. "Carl Henderson is safe too. Both of them are documenting everything, keeping detailed records of any interaction with management." Will's phone rang. Danny Wilson's name on the screen. "Mr. Carter, you need to know something. Pierce held a mandatory staff meeting this morning. He's threatening to fire anyone who talks to lawyers or the media. He says there are consequences for disloyalty. That's witness intimidation. We can use that. Maybe, but people are scared. Rebecca's not the only one with kids to feed. Danny's voice dropped. And there's something else. Pierce knows about the community center. He's been making calls trying to find out what you're planning. Will's stomach tightened. The community center on East Jefferson was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where his work would matter in ways that cleaning floors never could. If Pierce was targeting it, that meant scorched earth. How did he find out? The purchase is public record. He probably has someone watching real estate transactions. Danny sounded apologetic. I'm sorry, I thought you should know. The call ended. Margaret was already on her laptop pulling up property records and permits. Jonathan's face had gone hard with the kind of anger that turned calculating. Let him make his calls. The building's in our name. He can't touch it. He can make it harder to get permits. Inspections that take forever. Code violations that mysteriously appear. Will had seen this playbook before developers blocked by city bureaucracy when they didn't have the right connections. Pierce has been in Detroit long enough to have friends in the right offices. Margaret closed her laptop with deliberate calm. Then we make sure our friends are better connected than his. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts. The name she landed on made Will raise his eyebrows. Senator Patricia Michaels, Michigan State Legislature Chair of the Urban Development Committee. Maggie, we can't what use connections the same way Pierce does. Her voice was sharp. You taught us to work hard and play fair, Dad. But fair doesn't work when the other side is cheating. Sometimes you fight fire with fire. She dialed before Will could argue. The conversation was brief, professional, Margaret explaining the community center project with the efficiency of someone who'd argued cases before judges. When she mentioned Brandon Pierce by name, Will saw her expression sharpen. Yes, Senator, the same Brandon Pierce who's currently facing lawsuits for age discrimination and harassment, the same one whose company has received millions in city contracts despite documented workplace violations. A pause. I appreciate that. Yes, we'll send over the permits by end of day. She ended the call with the satisfaction of someone who'd just moved a chess piece into position. Senator Michaels sits on the committee that approves Riverside Towers city contracts. Those contracts come up for renewal in 6 months. She's very interested in making sure city money doesn't fund companies that abuse their workers. Jonathan laughed sharp and pleased. You just weaponized their own leverage against them. I learned from the best. Margaret looked at Will. You spent 8 years being afraid to use your position because you thought asking for help was weakness. But strength isn't doing everything alone. It's knowing when to call in reinforcements. The words hit harder than Will expected. He'd spent so long being invisible that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have people see him, really see him, and choose to stand beside him anyway. Patricia Green risking her career. Danny Wilson feeding them information. 3 NDA victims breaking their silence. All of them choosing courage over safety because Will had chosen to stand up first. His phone buzzed again, this time an unknown number with a Detroit area code. Mr. Carter, this is Dorothy Washington. I run the Detroit Community Outreach Center on Woodward. I saw your interview and I wanted to reach out. Will put the call on speaker. Dorothy's voice carried the warmth of someone who'd spent decades in service work, helping people who fell through society's cracks. I'm listening. We serve about 500 families. Low-income elderly homeless. We do what we can, but our building is falling apart. Roof leaks, plumbing fails, electrical system is a disaster waiting to happen. She paused. I heard you know something about fixing things. Will felt something stir in his chest. I do. We can't pay much, minimum wage maybe 20 hours a week. But if you're looking for work that matters, work that helps people who need it, we could use someone like you. Margaret was shaking her head, mouthing the words community center. Jonathan held up his phone showing the renovation budget they'd allocated. Hundreds of thousands of dollars to create something new. But Will was thinking about 8 years at Riverside Tower, fixing problems behind the scenes, making life easier for people who never knew his name. He'd done that work because he couldn't stand watching things break when he knew how to repair them. Dorothy Washington was offering him the same thing, just with people who'd actually notice. Can I think about it? Of course. But Mr. Carter, there's something else. We've got a 15-year-old boy who comes here after school. His father died in a construction accident 2 years ago. Good kid, smart, but he's running with the wrong crowd. Dropped out of school last month. Dorothy's voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched too many kids fall through the cracks. His name is Michael Thompson. I think he could use someone who understands what it's like when the world counts you out. Will's throat tightened. A boy without a father, just like Jonathan and Margaret, had been after Beth died. I'll come by tomorrow. We can talk about the building and the boy. Thank you, Mr. Carter. More than you know. The call ended. Margaret was staring at him like he'd grown a second head. You're actually considering taking a minimum wage job when we're trying to set you up with something better. Define better, Will met her eyes. You're offering me a building I'd manage. Dorothy's offering me work that needs doing and a kid who needs help. Which one sounds more like the man you think I am? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Jonathan was watching with something that might have been pride. You're impossible. I'm your father. It's in the job description. Will stood moving to the window. Outside, Detroit hummed with Saturday morning life. People heading to work, kids playing in streets that the city had mostly forgotten, communities holding together through sheer stubbornness. This was the city he'd landed in 15 years ago, broken and grieving, and somehow it had become home. What if we did both? Jonathan's voice cut through the silence. The community center on Jefferson could take 6 months to renovate properly. In the meantime, you volunteer at Dorothy's center, help her fix what's broken, work with this kid. When Jefferson's ready, you transition to managing it. Margaret caught on immediately. And we donate to Dorothy's center, fund the repairs properly, get her building up to code. Make it a partnership instead of competition. Will turned her back to face them. His children had transformed into the adults he'd raised them to be, people who saw problems and built solutions instead of accepting that some things couldn't be fixed. You two are dangerous when you work together. We learned that from watching you. Jonathan's voice was quiet. You taught us that the only thing more powerful than one person doing the right thing is a family doing it together. The moment hung there fragile and profound. Then Will's phone shattered it by ringing again. Klein, this time voice sharp with urgency. Turn on channel 7, now. Margaret grabbed the remote, flipping through channels until she found it. Brandon Pierce stood behind a podium at a press conference, looking composed and sympathetic in a way that made Will's skin crawl. These allegations are painful and disturbing. William Carter was a valued employee for many years, and we're saddened by his termination. Pierce's voice carried practiced remorse. However, the decision was made after careful review of multiple complaints from staff members who felt uncomfortable. We take workplace safety seriously, and sometimes that means making difficult choices. A reporter's voice from off-camera. What about the allegations of a pattern of harassment by executives at Riverside Tower? These allegations are being made by individuals with financial motivation to lie. Some are bound by NDAs because their previous claims were investigated and found to be without merit. We settled to avoid costly litigation, not because of guilt. Pierce leaned into the microphone. I want to be clear, Riverside Tower has zero tolerance for harassment. Any employee who has concerns can report them through our robust HR system. Margaret threw the remote at the couch. He's painting Dad as the problem and himself as the victim. And he's calling our witnesses liars. He's also defaming people under NDA, which violates those agreements. Klein's voice came through the phone speaker. I can use this. Pierce just gave those victims grounds to break their NDAs and sue for defamation. Will watched Pierce's performance, seeing the calculation behind every word. This was a man who'd spent his career manipulating perception, turning victims into problems, and abusers into misunderstood professionals. He was good at it, polished in ways Will could never be. We need to respond. Jonathan was already typing on his phone. Press conference of our own. Today. No. Will's voice cut through the planning. Not today. They both turned to stare at him. Will understood the impulse to fight back immediately to match Pierce's narrative with their own. But he'd spent 8 years watching executives play these games, and he'd learned something important. Sometimes the most powerful move was patience. He's expecting us to respond emotionally, to lash out, make accusations, give him ammunition to paint us as vindictive. Will's voice was steady. We don't give him that. We let the evidence speak. We let Patricia's testimony drop like a bomb. We let the NDA victims tell their stories on their timeline, not his. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You're playing chess while he's playing checkers. I'm playing the long game. Pierce has been winning short games his whole career. Nobody's ever forced him to think more than one move ahead. Klein's voice crackled with approval. Smart. We file our response in court where it matters, not in the media where he controls the narrative. And when Patricia's deposition goes public, it contradicts everything he just said. How long until that happens? Her deposition is scheduled for Tuesday. It becomes part of the public record immediately. Klein paused. You sure you want to wait 3 days while he controls the story? Will thought about the 15-year-old boy Dorothy had mentioned, Michael Thompson, running with the wrong crowd because his father died and left a hole nobody filled. He thought about Rebecca Miller, afraid in parking garages because reporting harassment meant losing health care for her daughter. He thought about every person who'd been told to know their place and had accepted it because fighting back seemed impossible. I'm sure. Let him think he's winning. The fall hits harder from higher up. The weekend crawled by. Pierce's press conference played on loop across local news, his calm denials getting more airtime than Will's original interview. Online comment sections filled with armchair lawyers debating who was lying. Some people saw through Pierce's performance. Others bought it completely, calling Will a money-grubbing fraud whose successful children were trying to shake down a legitimate company. Margaret wanted to fight back, in the comments crafting arguments and citing precedent. Jonathan wanted to call in favors, get friendly media coverage to counter Pierce's narrative. Will stopped both of them. Let it play out. Truth doesn't need us to force it. Truth needs advocates. Margaret's frustration was evident. People believe whoever sounds most convincing, not who's actually right. Then we make sure when our turn comes, we're so convincing there's no room for doubt. Sunday evening brought unexpected support. The video started circulating on social media. Employees from Riverside Tower speaking on camera with faces blurred and voices disguised. They talked about watching Will get walked out, about Pierce's treatment of staff, about HR complaints that disappeared into filing cabinets. Anonymous testimony carried its own power, the weight of people too afraid to show their faces, but too angry to stay silent. By Monday morning, the hashtag Invisible Workers was trending. People shared stories of being fired for age, for reporting harassment, for refusing to stay quiet in the face of abuse. Will's story had become a catalyst, permission for thousands of others to speak up. Dorothy Washington called again, her voice urgent. Mr. Carter, can you come to the center today? Michael's here and he's in trouble. Will was in his car within minutes, following GPS directions to a building that looked like it had survived decades through sheer force of will. Brick facade, crumbling windows patched with plywood, a sign over the door that read, Detroit Community Outreach Center, in fading letters. Inside was organized chaos. Elderly residents playing cards in a corner, children doing homework at battered tables, volunteers serving lunch from a kitchen that smelled like hope and determination. Dorothy met him at the door, a woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen everything Detroit could throw at them. He's in my office, won't talk to anyone. She led Will down a hallway to a small room barely big enough for a desk and 2 chairs. A teenager sat slumped in one chair. Hood pulled up, body language screaming, "Leave me alone." Dorothy closed the door behind them, leaving Will alone with the boy. Will sat in the other chair without speaking. They sat in silence for 30 seconds. A minute. 2. Finally, the boy looked up, eyes red and defiant. Dorothy called some janitor to fix me. That's her solution. I'm not here to fix you. Will's voice was calm. I'm here because Dorothy asked, and she seems like someone worth listening to. You don't know anything about me. I know your name is Michael Thompson. I know your father died 2 years ago in a construction accident. I know you dropped out of school and you're running with people who'll get you killed or locked up. Will paused. And I know what it's like when your whole world falls apart and nobody's there to help put it back together. Michael's defenses cracked slightly. Yeah, what do you know about it? My wife died 15 years ago, left me with 2 kids to raise and no idea how to do it. I had a good job that I lost when the economy collapsed. Spent 2 years watching everything I'd built disappear. Will met the boy's eyes. I understand what it feels like when the ground drops out and you're falling. So what did you do? I survived. Found another job, kept my kids fed, pretended I had answers when I was just as lost as they were. Will's voice dropped. And I spent 15 years alone because I thought asking for help made me weak. Turns out I was wrong about that. Michael's hood came down, revealing a face too young to carry so much anger. My dad used to fix cars, taught me about engines before. He trailed off. Mom works 2 jobs now, never home. I'm supposed to be the man of the house, but I don't know how to be anything. Being a man doesn't mean having all the answers. It means showing up even when you're scared. It means asking for help when you need it. Will gestured toward the door, toward the center beyond. Dorothy's offering you help. She's got people here who can help with school, with finding work, with learning skills that'll matter. Why do you care? Will thought about that. Because someone should have cared about me when I was drowning. Because maybe if I'd had help earlier, I wouldn't have wasted so much time pretending I didn't need it. Michael studied him with eyes older than his years. You really were a janitor. For 8 years, best job I ever hated. And your kids, they really worth millions. My kids are worth more than money could measure. But yeah, they're successful. Will leaned forward. Want to know the truth? Their success doesn't mean anything if they use it to hide from the world. Real success is what you build for other people, not what you accumulate for yourself. The words settled between them. Michael's shoulders relaxed incrementally, some of the defensive anger draining away. Dorothy said you might teach me to fix stuff, like electrical work and plumbing. I could do that if you're willing to show up and work. School too. School too. Dorothy runs a GED program here. You get your diploma, learn a trade, you'll have options your father would be proud of. Michael's eyes went bright with tears he was fighting. I miss him. I know. I miss my wife every day. Will's voice was gentle. But they're not coming back, and we've got to figure out how to keep going without them. That doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying them with us while we build something they'd want to see. The boy nodded just once, but it felt like a victory. Dorothy knocked and entered, reading the room with practiced ease. Michael, why don't you go help Marcus set up for the afternoon program? We'll talk about school tomorrow. Michael left, still guarded but less hostile. Dorothy sat on the edge of her desk. You have a gift. I have experience being broken. Turns out that's useful when talking to broken people. The building's falling apart, Mr. Carter. I don't know how much longer we can keep the doors open. She gestured around the office. The city keeps threatening to condemn us. We can't afford the repairs, and without this place, 500 families lose their only safety net. Will thought about the community center on East Jefferson, the hundreds of thousands Margaret and Jonathan were spending on renovations. Thought about Dorothy's center already serving the people who needed it most, held together by duct tape and determination. My kids want to help. They're good at that, even if they're sometimes annoying about it. Dorothy's smile was weary. I'm too old to be proud. If your kids can help keep these doors open, I'll take it. Then we'll make it happen. But I want to work here. Minimum wage, part-time, whatever you can afford. I'll fix what's broken and help with kids like Michael. Why you could be managing your own center, getting paid real money. Will stood looking out the small window at the people filling Dorothy's center. People who'd been invisible their whole lives, forgotten by a city that had forgotten itself. Because this is where I'm needed. The other center can wait. These people can't. Tuesday morning brought Patricia Green's deposition. Will sat in Klein's office watching via video feed as Patricia methodically destroyed Riverside Tower's defense. She walked through years of complaints filed and ignored settlements paid to bury problems, terminations orchestrated to remove anyone who challenged Pierce's authority. The lawyer deposing her was sharp, looking for inconsistencies. Ms. Green, you're testifying against your employer while still employed there. Isn't it possible you're motivated by fear of your own termination? Patricia's response was ice. I was terminated yesterday. The moment I informed Riverside Tower of my intent to cooperate with this lawsuit, I was escorted out by security. So no, I'm not afraid of termination. I've already lost my job for telling the truth. Margaret swore softly. They fired her for cooperating with Discovery. That's textbook retaliation. Klein was typing frantically. We add Patricia to the plaintiff list. Wrongful termination for her pattern and practice for everyone else. This case just got a lot bigger. The deposition continued for 3 hours. By the time it ended, Patricia had provided documentation of 16 wrongful terminations over 6 years, 4 sexual harassment settlements, and a culture of retaliation that went all the way to Robert Caldwell. The evidence was damning, precise, impossible to refute. Klein ended the video feed, his expression caught between satisfaction and concern. This is enough to bury them, but they'll fight. Riverside Tower has deep pockets and expensive lawyers. This could drag on for years. How long until this deposition is public record? It already is. Filed with the court an hour ago. Klein pulled up his computer. And I'm seeing news alerts already. The story's breaking. By noon, every major outlet in Michigan was running the story. Former HR director exposes systematic abuse at Riverside Tower. The headlines wrote themselves, each one another nail in Pierce's carefully constructed coffin. Will's phone rang. Danny Wilson, voice tight with barely suppressed excitement. Mr. Carter, you need to see what's happening here. Employees are walking out. Not just custodial staff, everyone. IT, accounting, administrative assistants. The whole building's shutting down. They're striking. They're quitting. 20 people so far just walked out with boxes of their stuff. Pierce is losing his mind, threatening lawsuits, calling security. But they keep leaving. Will felt something shift in his chest. The invisible workers were making themselves seen, and they were doing it by refusing to be invisible anymore. Is Rebecca safe? Rebecca led the walkout. She gave a speech in the lobby about dignity and respect, and people started following her out the door. Danny's voice carried awe. She's a hero, Mr. Carter. They all are. The call ended. Margaret was watching him with a complicated expression. You did this. You showed them it was possible to fight back. They did this themselves. I just went first. Jonathan's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and his expression went predatory. It's Riverside Tower's legal team. They want to talk settlement. Already. Patricia's deposition scared them. The walkout terrified them. Jonathan answered on speaker, his voice professionally neutral. Jonathan Carter. The voice on the other end belonged to someone expensive. Mr. Carter, I represent Riverside Tower. We'd like to discuss resolution of the pending litigation. I'm listening. Your father's termination was clearly a mistake. We're prepared to offer full reinstatement with back pay, a formal apology, and a settlement payment of $250,000 in exchange for dismissal of all claims in a comprehensive NDA. Will's hands clenched. $250,000 to go away quietly, to let Pierce keep his job and his reputation, to ensure nobody else learned what had happened. Margaret was shaking her head violently. Jonathan's face had gone cold. That's an insulting offer. Jonathan's voice could have cut steel. You're asking us to take money and silence, which tells me you're terrified of what comes next. We're being more than generous. Your father was a janitor. $250,000 is more than he'd make in a decade. My father was an employee you threw away. The lawsuit isn't about money, it's about accountability. Everything is about money, Mr. Carter. You're a businessman. You understand leverage and cost-benefit analysis. This lawsuit will cost both sides millions in legal fees. Why not settle now and avoid the expense? Jonathan looked at Will, the question clear in his eyes. This was the easy way out, the path that ended the stress and the exposure and the risk. $250,000 was real money enough to be comfortable enough to matter. Will thought about Michael Thompson learning to fix electrical systems, about Dorothy Washington keeping her doors open with duct tape and prayer, about Rebecca Miller giving a speech in a lobby where she'd been terrified for months, about every person who'd ever been told to know their place and had believed it because fighting seemed impossible. He shook his head. Jonathan's smile was sharp. My father declines your offer. See you in court. He ended the call before they could respond. The silence in Klein's office was profound. You just turned down $250,000. Klein sounded more amazed than concerned. Money fixes some problems. It doesn't fix systemic abuse. Will's voice was steady. If we settle quietly, Pierce keeps his job and does this to someone else next year. The NDAs stay in place, the victims stay silent, and nothing changes. If we go to trial, we risk losing everything. We risk losing money, but we've already won what matters. Will stood moving to the window overlooking Detroit's skyline. Every person who walked out of that building today chose courage over safety. Every victim who's coming forward chose truth over silence. Win or lose in court, we've already changed something. Margaret joined him at the window. You sound like Mom. Your mother believed that some battles matter more than victory. She believed you fight for what's right even when the odds are terrible. Will's voice carried 15 years of grief and growth. I spent 8 years being invisible because I was afraid of losing the little I had. But being invisible is its own kind of losing. At least this way I go down fighting. The week that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. News coverage intensified as more employees came forward with stories of abuse and retaliation. The 3 NDA victims gave on-camera interviews, their voices shaking but determined, as they described years of harassment and the settlements that had bought their silence. Riverside Tower's stock price began to slide. Tenants started asking questions about their leases. The city announced a review of all contracts with companies facing workplace abuse allegations. Everything Pierce had built on intimidation and silence was crumbling, exposed to light it couldn't survive. Brandon Pierce went silent. No more press conferences, no more calm denials. His lawyers filed motions to dismiss, to seal evidence, to delay proceedings. Every motion was denied. The case was moving forward with the inevitability of a glacier, slow and unstoppable. Will spent his days at Dorothy's Center teaching Michael Thompson how to rewire outlets and fix leaking pipes. The boy was a fast learner, hungry for knowledge and purpose in ways that reminded Will of Jonathan at that age. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared understanding rather than lack of things to say. Dorothy watched them work with satisfaction. You're good for him, better than any counselor we could afford. He's good for me, too, reminds me why any of this matters. The community center on East Jefferson was progressing. Margaret and Jonathan overseeing renovations that would transform it into something remarkable. But Will found himself more invested in Dorothy's crumbling building, in the people who came through its doors carrying weights nobody should carry alone. A month after the lawsuit was filed, Robert Caldwell resigned. The official statement cited personal reasons, but the timing told its own story. Riverside Tower was cleaning house, removing anyone too closely associated with the scandal. Patricia's replacement as HR director was brought in from outside, someone with a reputation for actually investigating complaints. Brandon Pierce remained protected by contracts and corporate inertia. His position had been diminished, his authority curtailed, but he still collected a paycheck and still walked the halls of Riverside Tower like he owned them. Until the news broke on a Friday afternoon. Federal investigators had opened a criminal probe into workplace safety violations at Riverside Tower, triggered by Carl Henderson's documentation of ignored maintenance requests. What started as a civil lawsuit over wrongful termination had metastasized into something bigger: federal charges that carried prison time rather than just financial penalties. Pierce was arrested at his home that same day, walked out in handcuffs, while news cameras recorded every second. The image went viral within hours, the powerful executive reduced to just another man who'd broken the law and gotten caught. The charges were criminal negligence and conspiracy to defraud. If convicted, he faced 10 to 15 years. Will felt no satisfaction in Pierce's downfall, just a weary recognition that actions eventually caught up with everyone. The man had spent years hurting people and hiding behind corporate protection. Now that protection had evaporated and he was facing consequences he'd spent his career avoiding. Margaret called an hour after the arrest. The settlement offer just increased. $2 million split between you, Patricia, Rebecca, and the other plaintiffs. Full reinstatement for anyone who wants it, policy changes, oversight, everything. What about Pierce? Fired effective immediately, escorted out by federal agents, so that part's already handled. She paused. This is a good offer, Dad. Better than we'd get at trial. Will thought about $2 million, life-changing money that could secure futures and fund dreams. Thought about the community center, about Dorothy's building, about every person who'd stood up because he'd shown them it was possible. What do the others want? Patricia wants policy changes more than money. Rebecca wants her job back with protection. The NDA victims want their stories on record. Margaret's voice softened. They're all looking to you to decide. Will walked outside, phone pressed to his ear, Detroit's evening air cool against his face. Across the street, kids played basketball under a streetlight that flickered but kept burning. Life continuing in the margins, people finding joy in the spaces the world had forgotten. Take the settlement. Make sure everyone's protected. Make sure the policies actually change. Put the money into Dorothy's Center and the Jefferson Project. Build something that lasts. You're giving away $2 million. I'm investing it in futures. Mine Michael's every person who walks through Dorothy's doors. Will's voice carried certainty he hadn't felt in years. Money's only valuable if you use it for something that matters. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Mom would be proud of you. Your mother would tell me I'm being stubborn and impractical and exactly the man she married. Yeah, she would. Margaret's voice cracked around the edges. I miss her. Me too, sweetheart. Every single day. The settlement was finalized 3 weeks later. $2 million split among 6 plaintiffs, with the majority going to fund community programs and workplace reform initiatives. Riverside Tower implemented mandatory training, independent oversight, and a whistleblower protection program that actually had teeth. Rebecca Miller returned to her job with a promotion to facilities supervisor, leading the team that kept the building running. Patricia Green took a position with a nonprofit that investigated workplace abuse, using her experience to protect others. The NDA victims got their stories on record, testimony that would help prosecutors in Pierce's criminal trial. Will took his share, $250,000 that felt simultaneously enormous and inadequate, and put it into Dorothy's Center. New roof, updated electrical plumbing that didn't leak, a kitchen that passed health inspections. The building transformed from crumbling relic to community cornerstone. Michael Thompson got his GED and enrolled in a vocational program for electrical work, his future suddenly full of possibilities instead of dead ends. He still came to the center 3 days a week helping Will with repairs and learning that work done with purpose felt different than work done from desperation. The community center on East Jefferson opened 6 months later, a partnership between Dorothy's Center and the Carter Family Foundation that Margaret and Jonathan had established. Will split his time between both locations, fixing what was broken and helping people who'd been invisible find their voices. On a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year after Will had been fired, he stood in the Jefferson Center, looking at walls Michael had helped paint, at floors they'd installed together, at a space transformed from nothing into something that mattered. His phone rang, Jonathan calling from Chicago with excitement in his voice that reminded Will of when his son was 7 and discovered something amazing. Dad, you're not going to believe this. PBS wants to do a documentary about the lawsuit about the community centers about workers' rights. They want to call it The Invisible. Will smiled, thinking about all the people who'd stood up, spoken out, refused to stay silent. Tell them yes, but make sure they talk to Rebecca and Patricia and Dorothy. This was never just about me. I know, that's why it matters. Through the window, Will watched Margaret arrive carrying boxes of supplies for the afternoon programs. She'd taken a leave from her law firm to focus on the foundation, using her skills to build rather than litigate. She looked happier than he'd seen her since Beth died, like she'd finally found purpose beyond accumulating wins. His children had learned what he'd tried to teach them, that success measured in dollars was empty if it didn't create meaning. They'd built careers and wealth, and then they'd used both to build something bigger than themselves. Beth would have been proud. Will turned from the window, moving through the center toward the classroom where Michael was teaching younger kids basic electrical safety. The boy had found his calling and helping others discover theirs, the cycle continuing in ways that would outlive all of them. This was what victory looked like. Not a courtroom win or a financial settlement, though both mattered. Victory was kids learning skills that would lift them out of poverty. It was Dorothy's Center staying open. It was Rebecca walking through Riverside Tower without fear. It was every person who saw Will's story and found courage to tell their own. He'd spent 54 years learning that strength wasn't carrying everything alone. It was knowing when to ask for help, when to accept it, when to offer it to others. The invisible didn't stay invisible because they were powerless. They stayed invisible because the world refused to see them. Will Carter had forced the world to look. And in looking, the world had discovered that the people it counted as nothing were capable of changing everything.